joining the Faculty Professional Development webinar today. And we have two phases of this webinar. The first phase is based on two sessions, theory into practice. And the second phase is based on focus on research. And that has two sessions as well. So we are actually presenting the critical reflection for transformative learning, and we have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Katrina Lu from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, US. Let me introduce you about Dr. Katrina, who is working as Associate Professor in Teacher Education Department of Teaching and Learning, University of Nevada. Dr. Lu's current research includes preparing critically reflective teachers for transformative learning, developing self-sustaining communities of practice for teacher professional development, and understanding social capital and resilience among teachers of color. She is a great researcher and she has secured funding from the different channels as well. Very warm welcome, Dr. Katrina, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much to having me here. Hi, good morning, everybody. How are you? Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity. So now I'm gonna share the screen with you. So please let me know if you're able to see it. Okay, so now I'm putting it as the full screen. Are you able to see the full screen now?
That's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So as Dr. Shawkat has introduced, the topic today is critical reflection for transformative learning. So what I'm going to introduce is to give you a very quick overview of the theory of transformative learning. And then I'm going to talk about how this framework can help faculty professional development through research and teaching. I will give you a couple examples based on my research and practice as a teacher educator, and hopefully we can have some discussion about your experiences of supporting transformative learning, either through your research or your teaching. So first, I would like to show you a picture. So when you see this picture, I would like you to think about a few assumptions. What are the few assumptions do you have based on the picture you see? Just spend 10 seconds. And the second question is, imagine the people who live in that type of house. So what kind of assumptions, discussion about your experience about those people, about the children living in such families? Okay, probably you have certain words popping up immediately, right? This is a rural, looks like very rural, and definitely we see poverty. And probably another assumption is there's a lack of education or opportunities. And in terms of the people, the family live in that kind of household. And a few assumptions we probably gonna have is like backward, no culture, uneducable, miserable, or no future. Okay, so I would like to share a little bit about my story. People are storytellers, and we learn a lot from our stories. So actually, I was born and grew up in this house. And I was born in a very small village in the south central part of China. And when I was growing up, there was a huge disparity, a huge divide between the rural and the urban. And the rural has a lot of features. People assume people living in the rural areas, they have less education, they have less opportunities, and they probably have no bright future. And also in China, we hold some traditional views about your family and the lineage, right? There's a saying in China saying, dragon produces dragon, phoenix produces phoenix. and the mouse children can only dig holes. So that means, people believe that when you're living and grow up in certain type of families or environment, you are doomed to have certain types of future. So imagine if my parents believed in that and followed those assumptions, they would not support me for my education. And imagine if my teachers accepted those assumptions, especially those assumptions still hold true in some parts of China and the world, that girls should not receive too much education. Then my teachers would not hold me up, would not give me high expectations and support. So fortunately, they didn't believe in those assumptions. My parents worked very hard as farmers. They both didn't even finish elementary education due to the historical times. They worked very hard to support my education. And then my teachers also supported me, and they inspired me to become a teacher, become an educator. And their support, their high expectations made me to believe in my own potential. So I eventually went to college and get my teaching license, and I taught many years before I went up. You can see this is the small village in the central south part of China. So eventually I went up to Beijing to complete my dream to go to Beijing, the capital city, and get my master's. And during my master's, I started to open up and applied to do a PhD program in the University of Madison, Wisconsin. And from there, I got my PhD and become a teacher educator. And now I'm working here in Las Vegas as a teacher educator in the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So we talk about assumptions. Assumptions are important. And then what are assumptions? Assumptions are things we accept oftentimes without questioning or proof. And assumptions are a set of codes that guide our beliefs and attitudes about the world, about ourselves. And assumptions are oftentimes taken for granted and goes without saying. And assumptions are influenced by habitual way of thinking, feeling, and acting. And also, assumptions are not just personal. They're very cultural, social, political, educational. And assumptions are important. Why? Because they directly guide what we do, the actions we perform. And at the same time, the actions we perform oftentimes, again, reinforce the assumptions we have. So my work is heavily based on an adult education researcher and a theorist, Jack Maslow. So according to his definition, assumptions are a set of codes that might be cultural, social, educational, economic, political, or psychological. And as assumptions frames our tacit points of view and influences our thinking, beliefs, attitudes, and actions. Unfortunately, our assumptions are often wrong. Why? Because our assumptions are heavily dependent on a lot of distortions. We have epistemic distortions that deals with the nature and the use of knowledge. And we have social cultural distortions. And we also have psychic distortions. Psychic distortions are related to individuals, especially individuals' presuppositions generating unwarranted anxiety that impedes taking actions. So let's look at some of very common assumptions in the world, and I think in our daily lives. For example, there are assumptions about gender. And girls are good at language learning, boys are good at math and science. And girls like to imitate playing kitchen stuff, and boys like to build things. And music in poor and rural people is simpler than music of the urban elite, and therefore has less value. And certain groups of students have behavior issues and thus need to be disciplined more. And oops, I'm sorry. Kids from poor communities are academically less competent. And so these assumptions will drive our beliefs and attitudes when we interact with people and interact with the world. And at the same time, those beliefs and attitudes will drive our actions. And so actions are affected by assumptions. And assumptions direct how individuals act in society. So let's go back to the one assumption. Girls like to imitate playing kitchen stuff, and the boys like to build things. So I would like to share with you a story based on one of my research observation. And this is the observation done in a preschool classroom. 3-year-olds. I'm sorry, my son is coming into the. I'm sorry, Pat. Please do not do that. That's not nice. I'm sorry about that. And so in this preschool classroom, the kids are always playing, different stations. So the classroom has the block station and the kitchen station, the role play station, so on and so forth. So every time when I observed that, and I found that a lot of boys oftentimes play at the block station, and the girls oftentimes they never go to the block station. And on the other hand, they always play in the kitchen cooking, clean dishes and stuff like that. So I asked one day, finally, the teacher in the classroom, I said, what do you think why boys always over there at the block station and the girls always in the kitchen station? And before the teacher responded, actually at that time, there is an administrator of the preschool in the classroom, and she responded immediately saying, oh, we understand the girls like to play in the kitchen and boys always likes to build things. That's why we deliberately set up those stations so then they can have the free choice. So my question is, do we really believe that's their free choice? Or do we think those choices of children, even as a 3-year-old, their choice is so much conditioned by the social context, by the videos they watch, by the things adults do. So it's not necessarily boys are born to believe that they want to be an engineer, or girls are born to believe they want to be a blondie. And again, if we believe the assumptions, if we have the assumptions that certain groups of people have behavioral issues and thus they need to discipline more, and probably the action of the teachers and the administrators will follow that assumption. And then the truth is, in the United States, for example, kids of color, especially Black boys, and especially if they are labeled as special education students, they're 3 times more likely to be disciplined more than their white counterparts. And if we truly have the assumption that kids from poor, diverse classrooms, they're academically less incompetent, and will probably have certain behaviors as the teachers. They're going to be placed they will have much less opportunity to be placed in gifted and talented programs. And then these realities, look at this data, oftentimes are used as, again, evidence to support our assumptions, instead of questioning the processes that attributed to the results. And the same thing here. And oftentimes our assumptions will disguise the reality and treat this data again as the evidence to fulfill our own assumptions again, rather than questioning what happened really in a classroom with more diverse student population, and we only have 1 out of 190 students out in the GATE program. However, if the student population diversity dropped to 29%, 1 out of 4 students are placed in GATE programs. What does that mean? What happened? What some problems, are behind, this picture? So anyways, that means the assumptions need to be questioned. Oops. And only by starting to question and analyze those assumptions, we can start to think problems behind there. And we can start to look for other solutions to make a difference. And then we can take actions to make a change. So now I would like to pause here for 10 seconds for you to reflect. What assumptions are common in your specific domain? You might be in the area of arts. You might be in the area of sociology. You might be in the area of science. And just let's think about the specific common assumptions in your field. Okay, so how do we get into analyzing the assumptions and looking for different solutions and implement some changes? And critical reflection plays a role in this process. So what does that mean, critical reflection? We hear reflection all the time, right? And teachers are required to reflect on our teaching, and the students are oftentimes required to write the reflective journals and post those journals in their e-portfolios, for example. And on a daily basis, we also reflect on what we do every day. So reflection has been used very, very widely. But what does that really mean, critical reflection? Critical reflection, according to Maslow, is a process of challenging our established assumptions, the meaning perspectives with which we have made sense out of our own encounters with the world, others, and ourselves. And the meaning perspectives are transformed through critically reflective assessment of epistemic, sociocultural, and psychic distortions. And critical reflection is important to make transformative learning happen. Transformative learning is learning that transforms the problematic frames of references to make them more inclusive, discriminating, reflective, open, and emotionally able to change. And transformative learning is a reconstructive theory focusing on adult learning. And that means it can be applied in different areas, like I mentioned. It could be applied in music, arts, and sociology, nursing, for example. And just let's think about how it could be used in your area specifically. So let's think about the relationship between critical reflection and transformative learning. According to Maslow and Brookfield, they're both are very famous scholars in adult education. Brookfield stated that reflection in and of itself is not enough. It must always be linked to how the world can be changed. That means a change implemented in the process is important. And Maslow mentioned that reflective discourse and its resulting insights alone do not make for transformative learning. Acting upon these emancipatory insights, a praxis is also necessary. So praxis, again, we're talking about action. So Maslow calls for a recognition of a critical dimension of learning in adulthood that enables us to recognize, reassess, and modify the structures of assumptions and expectations that frame our tacit point of view and influence our thinking, belief, and attitudes and actions. So that's critical reflection for transformative learning. And based on a couple decades of research and also teaching, Maslow identified 10 phases of transformative learning. And it started with a disorienting dilemma. And this is very similar to what John Dewey calls a puzzle. When we have a dilemma or puzzle, we are more likely to study, to think about the basis of those problems, and then study to have a self-examination and followed with a critical assessment of assumptions and the recognition of a connection between one's discontent and the process of transformation. And the fifth step is exploration of options for new roles, relationships, and action. And then we need to plan a course of action. And of course, we need to acquire knowledge and skills for implementing those plans. And then to have some provisional trying of the new roles. And finally, we will build competence and self-confidence in new roles and relationships, and reintegration into one's life on the basis of conditions dictated by one's new perspectives. So, based on Jack Maslow and Steve Brookfield's work, I developed a critical reflection for transformative learning in education framework, specifically for teachers and pre-service teachers. So these 6 stages included assumption analysis and contextual awareness, imaginative speculation, reflective skepticism, and reflection based on actions. Remember, Jack Maslow said we need to have a plan, action plan to implement those actions, and a reflection on the effect of on the actions, specifically on the learner if you're teaching the students, and then how those actions gonna actually impact our assumptions. And then we can start another round. So this shows that critical reflection for transformative learning, starting with assumption analysis, and then develop into implemented actions. And then those actions can help us to revisit and revise our framework of references, those assumptions, and then get the next round. So, and specifically in the context of teachers, I made some definitions. You can see explanations. The assumption analysis for teachers means they identify the assumptions about schooling and the society that underlie the ideas, beliefs, values, and actions that they and others take for granted, and then compare those assumptions against their lived experiences and that of their students. And so then we studied the contextual awareness. That means they gain an understanding like how those assumptions are created in a specific social historical context, right? And then imaginative speculation is the process to look for alternative solutions, right? And then reflective skepticism is really developing a critical cast of the mind to doubt the claims made for the universal validity or truth of an idea, practice, or institution, especially related to things of inequity, like, for example, related to students of color, how we're going to assume them, and then we have take specific actions to deal with them. And then reflection-based action is we actually integrate those alternative solutions and then reflect on the impact and integrate those reflection on revisit our assumptions. So now again, I would like to pass 10 seconds again to continue reflect. How do the assumptions you just reflected on, those common assumptions in your specific field, impact people's actions? No matter it's dealing with patients or teaching about art and music or teach specific students in the classroom. Okay. So now we learned a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings of critical reflection and the transformative learning, and then the process of transformative learning, I would like to propose that this framework can be used as a theoretical framework to conduct research, as well as a pedagogical framework for teaching and learning for faculty. So I'm going to share with you two examples, maybe three if we have time. The first example is using this framework as a theoretical framework to get research. So this example is my own research to study assumptions and actions of prospective teachers' approach to race and racism. As we all know, race and racism is an important issue in the United States, especially when the student population has been becoming more and more diverse. As of 2014 and 15, the public school students population in the United States is no longer white majority. That means more than 50% of students in the public schools in the United States are students of color coming from diverse racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds. And in the school district, I am where my student teachers primarily placed for their student teaching, and we have more than 70% of student diversity. That means 1 out of 5 students only in average in the classroom is white. All the other 4 students out of the 5 are coming from very different backgrounds than the white. However, most of the teachers are white, and we have more than 70% of the teachers teaching in this school district is white. Nationwide, we have more than 80% of teachers in the United States are white. So that means it's very important for teacher educators and the teachers themselves to understand what kind of assumptions do we have or do our teachers have in terms of race and racism, and what kind of actions they take in dealing with race and racism in the specific classroom. And so, since the theoretical framework of critical reflection for transformative learning emphasize 2 things. Number one, it emphasizes it's important to understand assumptions. However, it is more important to understand what actions people take based on their assumptions. And we know in teacher education and maybe in other areas of teaching as well, we spend a lot of time trying to change, try to influence our students' assumptions. And we have achieved a certain success, right? And we have a lot of research, especially, for example, in teacher education, to study the impact of certain pedagogical approaches on the change of student teachers' attitudes, their attitudes about multicultural education, for example, their attitudes about special education students. And oftentimes we research results show after some kind of teaching and the field experience, they are able to change their assumptions. They change to from a more negative view about certain groups of students to be a more positive view. Okay, that's great. But at the same time, the theoretical framework of critical reflection for transformative learning telling us assumption change is important. However, without seeing any implemented transformative actions, and we are not able to claim that we are there yet. So this framework guided me to do triangulated data design for triangulated data and analysis through this approach. For example, I collected data for of reflective writing to study pre-service teachers' assumptions and self-reported actions that they write for their e-portfolios and journals. And I also collected the interview data to get a little bit deeper understanding about their assumptions and also self-reported actions, like what actions they take. And then, more importantly, I conducted longitudinal classroom observation to really see the practice, the action they implement in the classroom. And then I also collected data from teacher educators. And this have been going on for a few years, this study. So I'll show, I'm not going to go too much detail, but I'm only showing like how this framework can be used for data analysis and visualization of the findings. So this is visualization of the overall finding. I followed with four cases for about a year and a half. So from this four cases, based on the theoretical framework, I can map out and basically map out where we are, where the students are. So if you look at this diagram, you can see I have one spectrum of critical reflection, means mostly in their writing, right? So you have no critical reflection at all. That means they have no assumption analysis. They didn't talk about how they analyzed their assumptions or searched for other solutions. They didn't question any social political connections about teaching, nothing, right? And it's more technical. So that means according to Van Manen, for example, technical description of what happened in the classroom, that's not critical reflection. And then on the right, you can see they have critical reflection. That means they're able to analyze assumptions and talking about their own assumptions and how they challenge those assumptions. And based on that, what kind of alternative ways they actually searched for in their writing. They talk about in their writing, and they might talk about their practice in their writing as well. And then on the vertical part, you can see the spectrum of transformative actions through classroom teaching. So the bottom is no transformative action. So that means there are two possibilities. Number one is they didn't talk about actions. They didn't show any actions in their teaching. And then on the top is they did talk about actions, and they did talk about, reflect about solutions and actions. They actually implement transformative actions. So the goal as a teacher educator is to move our students from the lower spot to the top right spot. So that means they're able to articulate through writing, and at the same time, they are able to implement transformative action in the classroom. Unfortunately, based on my longitudinal study, oftentimes some students are able to articulate, but they are not necessarily able to integrate transformative actions, and less likely to actually, again, transform their distorted assumptions. So and some students are in the middle, and their critical reflection and transformative learning are kind of emerging. Okay, I'm giving you some specific example. I'm gonna based on one case, Judy. So Judy was very articulate about equity and social justice and the importance of supporting students of color in the classroom. So she articulated in her e-portfolio that the principle of equity is what she strives to achieve, and is the common thread in her thinking about students' planning and the reflection. So she designed, in terms of action, she designed an equity unit, try to include different cultural practices, different cultural celebrations based on the families of the students in her classroom. So this unit, she actually, in order to teach this unit, she invited multiple community members to guest teach in her classroom, including a Jewish father to teach about Hanukkah, and African American teacher from the community to teach about Kwanzaa celebration. And she actually invited a Chinese to talk about the Chinese winter solstice celebration. So she integrated the ideas of community-based, teaching by integrating community resources, inviting community members into her classroom. So then in her reflection, she reflected the technical process of those lessons. For example, they made the Kwanzaa mats and cups and learned about 7 principles and applied it. And then, but in reality, and she sort of fall back into labeling and discipline a kid of color, especially one African American child. And so when the Chinese speaker went in, they immediately warned the speaker that they had a difficult child. If that child is not behaving, they will take her out. And eventually, at the end of that class, the child was taken out because with a very for me, it's a minor issue because it's not related to her breaking any rules. She just didn't follow. She didn't put on a T-shirt, as an artist shirt when she was doing the art time, and then that was disciplined. And so when I asked her about her assumption about this child and her behavior, and then Judy responded that I think that's her culture. So she feels like she can move her body because she wants to move her body. So she made a simple assumption about African American bodies want to move around in the classroom. And then she has untransformed actions. So based on that assumption, and their action is a zero tolerance. So what we are doing is to give her one chance, and then if she did it again, or didn't listen or talk back, she was out. And she strongly believed that this child actually needed this consequence. Otherwise, she would walk over you. So the framework helped me to map out Judy's thinking and thinking process as well as her action. And she had some, searching for alternative solutions. Actually, she implemented those solutions in the classroom. However, this action did not automatically and ultimately change her distorted assumption about this African American girl. She still believed that her moving the body is related to her culture rather than thinking this child joined the class in the middle of the semester without prior schooling experiences. This is a kindergarten classroom, by the way. And rather than challenging those assumptions that is very culturalistic, and she actually this unit didn't achieve that transformation. So this framework again helped me to map out their assumptions and actions. I can see the student teachers have certain assumptions. They usually simplify the connection between race, culture, and the behavior. They believe when a student behaves certain ways, it's because of their culture. And they're able to pledge, means commitment. They oftentimes they're able to say they're committed to social justice and equity. But in actions, especially in those unexpected time, when they're not, it's not exactly what they planned, they are more likely to fall back, the backsliding into patterns of, institutional racism, like disciplining the body and segregating the body of kids of color. So now I would like to pause for 10 seconds again for you to think about how would you help critical analysis of the assumptions in your field, help your students, help your colleagues, for example, to critically analyze those assumptions. Okay, do I still have time? Should I share the second example quickly as a pedagogical tool? Okay.
Yes.
So the second example is how this framework can be used as a pedagogical tool to guide our teaching and the support of the students. So this is a practice that I have been doing for a couple of years, using critical content narrative in preparing prospective teachers to teach for equity. A lot of this practice is based on the knowledge I gained from like the research I just shared with you about the challenges pre-service teachers encounter in terms of understanding race and racism and deal with it equitably. So this work is built on critical race theory and critical reflection for transformative learning, as well as generative change. So I use a critical content narrative because the experience of people of color should be legitimate, appropriate, and critical to understanding. And then, based on those sharing, based on the stories and the voices of people of color, we need to also identify strategies to combat these oppressive forces, and acting upon those strategies in an important is an important step, right? So I worked with Anita Ball, who has a framework of generative change, and she was the president of American Educational Research Association in 2012, I believe. And so I had the opportunity to work with her to combine my framework of critical reflection with for transformative learning and her framework of generative change. And then we produced a research in review of research in education paper this year. You can see this is a model of praxis for critical content narratives, starting with metacognitive awareness and ideological becoming, and then internalization, creative problem solving, and transformative learning. So on the left, these are the 6 stages of critical reflection, how they actually play a role in critical content narrative. So Anita Ball and I, we co-taught for a couple semesters. So we designed this pedagogical tool, integrating critical content narrative, critical scholarship, and reflective writing. And so we integrate a lot of activities to help the students to analyze and challenge prior assumptions. For example, the Museum of Me project is really help the students to look back into their backgrounds and how their culture and their cultural experiences shape who they are, and help them to study to understand what are some assumptions embedded in their experiences. And then we have activities to map out the social network. This is again a way to challenge assumptions about equal opportunities. For example, we ask our students to map out the network and those the important roles in their network. And after their analysis, they found that even though they grew up in very, very diverse communities, they have friends from friends of color, but those important roles like doctors, lawyers, dentists, professors, mostly occupied by white people. So that's kind of a shock for them. That's really challenged a lot of assumptions, like we have equal opportunities in the society because we all go to schools. And we also invite content narratives from the community, including community organization leaders and parents, teachers of color, to share their experiences about the assets communities of color have, their dreams, their hopes for their children's education. And then we started to help our students to map out the assets in the school and then look for solutions, alternative solutions, build on the new assumption that those kids and families have assets, have strength that can be integrated into teaching. So through this process, we are able to see some changes. The first thing is our students are able to study to identify and analyze distorted assumptions through those counter narratives, and they are able to study to search for alternative solutions. Some of them are able to integrate some changes. I give you a quick example. So Juan, who is you know, mixed, race. Her mom is white and the father is Peruvian. And he grew up in a very rich community. And then he believed that everybody has the equal opportunity. Tehran, however, he grew up with his parents because grandparents because his mother was a drug addictive. He believed himself as a troublemaker, and he was sent in jail for 6 months without committing any crime. It's totally wrong. And then he actually went back to college, and so the assumption analysis helped them to study to realize some social distortions. For example, Tyrone studied to realize, okay, he always thought he was a troublemaker. He have this, the psychic distortion, right? And he's the clone kid. But now he started to realize, okay, I'm like a lot of kids of color, I'm not less intelligent. I'm not less hardworking. I graduated from high school. I graduated from college. I'm here today. And this Tehran's experience also helped Huang to study to really challenge his assumption about equal opportunity. He believed that everybody like him had the opportunity, and then if they didn't achieve success, it's their own problem. And so Tehran's story really helped him to think about, what privilege means. And then they started to look for alternative solutions. For example, Tehran had some wrong assumptions about English language learners. So he assumed like because language is a barrier, they would have trouble to understand the content. But actually, based on his observation, his assumption was totally wrong. The kids are able to learn the content, even though sometimes the language is the barrier. And Huan also started to think he want to use diversity to make more learning tools, not having the kids to change their mind, but trying to build on their strength. I mean, the strengths of the kids with diverse backgrounds. So they have implemented certain actions. For example, Juan started to do a cultural heritage program. So he asked the kids to work with their parents and grandparents and map out their ancestors, where they're coming from. Then they realize, okay, the kids' families are coming from all over the world. And so, and also he was able to implement some other assets activities, thinking the kids need opportunities rather than give them low expectations. So he did a few projects, for example, inviting the author of How to Train the Dragon to speak to the kids virtually. He also invited a ranger from a national park to teach the kids about the local state animals and them to the ranger was able to give each kid a year permit to visit all those national parks throughout the country. So that's high expectation, believing in the potential of those kids rather than just teach them the very rigid and technical curriculum. So finally, I want to pause here. I know my time is almost up. What transformative solutions could be used to transform the assumptions you just reflected, and also the associated actions? Um, Here and pause. I would like to thank you for your attention. Okay,
Thank you so
and
much, Katrina, for your wonderful session, and it has been really interactive and productive as well. Now it's a time for the question answer, and this group is not shy at all. So I hope you have some couple of questions to be asked from Dr. Katrina. Can you please post your questions in the chat box? Okay, so we have one question, and even if you like to talk with Dr. Katrina in person, so you can talk with her as well. We have one question from Dr. Naima Qureshi. She
Mm-hmm.
is assistant professor in education, and she needs some clarity how the four participants are selected for this longitudinal study, the one who were able to articulate more, or she is just sharing the case of four for this seminar.
Okay, so that's a very good question. So the four cases are selected based on a few reasons. So the research lasted for a year and a half. When I started to do the research, I first need to give them the explanation about the study, invite them to participate. So altogether, there are two cohorts at that time. They were at the third semester. I'm sorry I didn't have time to give a more detailed the design, and I'm glad you asked the question. So when I started, they were in the third semester of a 5 semester elementary education program. So the reason why I selected third semester is because they're in the middle. They already did 2 semesters of e-portfolio reflection, and then they're finishing the third semester. So I was able to gain some understanding about where they are, what their understanding of e-portfolio. And then so I decided to follow them for 2 semesters for their action as well as their e-portfolio writing. So when I give them the consent, there are 2 cohorts. Each cohort there are about 25 students. And so I gave them the consent, and then about altogether 25 students agreed to participate in the research. And then about 8 of them are willing to be interviewed. So I started to interview those 8 people at the very beginning. And then because this need a very long longitudinal, it's really 2 semesters follow up. Each semester I interview them twice. I observe them 3 times at least. And then I also observe them in the e-portfolio writing time. So it's a lot of commitment from them. And eventually 4 actually continued without any, without any interruption. So to a certain point, that's because what data I'm able to get. Another thing is the 3 of the 4 cases, the 3 ladies are white, which really representative of the white student teacher population. And then the fourth case is a Black African American male, which again represent a very unique case of pre-service teachers of color in teacher education programs in the United States. So for that study, which is very reported in detail in my new book, is okay. So the selection have 2 factors impacted my selection. Number one is really what I get, right? Number two, fortunately, the cases are representative of the student population, mostly white. Once in a while, you have a few student teachers of color. And this student teacher of color is only one of the handful in the 50 student teachers. And of all those 25, there's only one pre-service teachers of color signed up the consent. So that's pretty much the only one I was able to study in terms of the pre-service teachers of color. So that's for the first study I shared. The second study I shared in terms of the participant selection, again, mostly is what they gave me the consent. But the second study, I was more focusing on using content narratives to prepare pre-service teachers of color, because content narrative involve the voices and the experiences of people of color. So that's a deliberate design. I want to focus on pre-service teachers of color. So I give the consent to inviting everybody in order to, give them equal opportunity. and then based on whatever I come back, actually, I have a few pre-service teachers of color cases in the research. But again, due to the time, I only shared two examples. I have way more example than what I shared. I hope that addressed a little bit of your question.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Christina. In connection of the previous question, Dr. Naima is asking, I want to know whether you teach the social justice or equity courses in pre-service teacher education program, or how they integrate these concepts in their formal courses.
Excuse me, the question is how do I teach about social justice and equity in my courses, right?
Yes.
And the second part, I didn't get it. The second part of the question is,
Yeah, formally or just informally, are you addressing the concept of critical transformative learning in one of your courses?
yes, formally. So
Okay.
this course, so this course is, my
Miss Katrina, I have one question.
yes.
Firstly, I would like to appreciate you to design such a good model for critical reflection for transformation. And we can use this model at university level where teachers are more trained and reflective. But in Pakistan scenario, especially at primary and elementary level, where is a shortage of resources and training for teachers, is there are some simple ways or practices that can enhance transformative learning.
I have to say there's no simple way because, as Maslow and other scholars mention, assumptions are so deeply rooted, right? Rooted in the oftentimes social distortions, those very long taken for granted values, and so changing the assumption takes a lot of time and effort. And fortunately, there's no quick way, so it takes time, and I designed it formally into my study, into my teaching, based on the sharing of the second example. So I designed the course based on the framework. So I give them readings about, for example, about diversity. I give them readings about funds of knowledge. So that helped them to study, to think from a different point of view, instead of thinking students with diverse background from a deficit point of view. They study to think from assets point of view. So as I shared in this slide, and this pedagogical design, I used specifically this framework. Let me see. This framework, I give them, specifically solicit critical counter narratives, especially from pre-service teachers of color, from their voices, like Tehran, for example, is an example showing when we are talking about, okay, do we really believe there is an equal opportunity for everybody in the schools, in the society, right? And so some students believe that because they believe they went to school, and especially those ones who never experienced, a lot of challenges, they strongly believed everybody should have the same opportunity. It's strongly based on, meritocracy, right? And so Tehran's experience say, look, I grew up in a single household, a grandparents' household, and so we did the privilege race as one example. So I give them a sequence of questions, like, if it's yes, then the step one step forward. For example, do you grow up with a two-parent household? If yes, they move forward. And then, do your parents receive college education? If yes, then they move forward. And do you need to pay for bills for your own education? Blah, blah, blah. So then Tehran and a few other students, and especially their students of color, they basically left behind. They didn't move because they grew up without parent. They ended up in jail, and then they had to work hard to pay for their bills, and nobody, so those kind of activities started to challenge those assumptions, very long taken for granted assumptions with critical scholarship. And so then they need to write about those experiences through weekly discussions. So it's a formally designed process to help the students to study, to think about those assumptions, but it doesn't mean they're automatically going to be transformed. I still have students that follow up. They strongly believe that some kids of color need to punish them more because they have bad behaviors. They still strongly believe that whoever could not succeed is because they didn't work hard. They are not able to see institutional barriers that actually prevent individuals from achieving their potential. So assumptions, it's hard to change. And also, again, actions, we hope they can take actions, but sometimes, again, there are barriers from pre-service teachers to actually implement actions, because what if their mentor teacher does not support that idea? And what if they don't have those resources, right? If they say, oh, I want to integrate the parents and community members, but as a student teacher, they don't know that community very well. They might not able to build that connection and invite them immediately. So as teacher educators or mentor teachers, we all need to work together to help integrating transformative actions. And pre-service teachers are not able to do this alone oftentimes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katrina. I have one more question. What are
Okay.
the what are the useful classroom activities to develop critical transformative learning?
Yeah, I have a few activities my students really thought very, very good. So number one, the activity of, like I said, the mapping out the social networks I showed. So I list like 20, positions like we often see in the community, like your dentist, your pediatrician, and your yard person, and the mailman, that kind of thing. So then they map out those ethnic distribution of those roles, and then they realize, wow, those important roles are mostly white. And then janitor, mailman, yard person are mostly held by people of color. They started to really think, okay, what's wrong? Does that really mean people of color are less intellectual, less capable, or something wrong with our system? Like we didn't support them enough. We, from the very beginning, you know, there are institutional barriers from them to achieve those success. So that's one example. Another example, very very helpful, I do every semester, is the community panel. The community panel, I invite some community organizations like the Southern Nevada Poverty Center, support children in poverty. And then I invited the LGBTQ Center to talk about, LGBTQ issues. I also invited a center for peace for youth, dealing with junior court. And so I also invited some parents of color. So their stories, for example, they share about those kids are eager to learn. However, they also have other concerns. And there are a lot of homeless children. Their priority is not to learn writing. Their priority is how to stay safe today. their priority is to how to have a meal next, during the next meal. So we cannot blame for those because they need to have those things to think about. So those barriers sometimes prevent them from focusing on the academic work, but it does not mean they're naturally not interested in academic work, right? And there are misassumptions about Latinx parent, like Latina parents. They think, oh, those parents don't care about kids' education. They only want to produce more children to get social welfare. But the parents telling we care about their education even more because that's the only way to make a difference, make a change. So those counter narratives from people who are oftentimes silenced, their voice silenced, and their stories are created for them by the majority, by the white culture. And so that's problematic. And so by inviting those voices that oftentimes silenced to really open up, the mind of my student teachers and help them to challenge some long-standing assumptions that have been, driving the actions in the society. So these are a couple of activities I feel it worked for my students. Um, thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katrina, for accepting my invitation and sharing the great information on transformative learning that's a need of today. And thanks for opening the new avenues of learning in the context of Pakistan. I'm really, really grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope there are other opportunities to learn from you. I'm sorry I was not able to see you all, see your faces. I hope there will be other opportunities. I will be able to interact with you face to face. And I
Yes,
would love to learn from you guys how you work with your students and how you help them to achieve transformative learning.
yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Katrina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay, bye bye. I'm gonna log out and feel free to share my slides with your colleagues. And if there are any questions, feel free to contact me. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye bye. Hasim, can you please stop the recording? Hasim, are you there? Wasim?